A giant cowboy lived alone for years until 12 Apache Beauties asked for shelter in his cabin. He thought his days of purpose were over. His cabin, nothing but wood and silence. But on a night when snow howled across the mountains, 12 desperate young women appeared at his door, their braids heavy with frost and a secret they could not tell. What began as a single act of mercy soon shook the whole valley. Whispers spread. He's hiding them, 12 squaws in his cabin. The church bell tolled, the sheriff came knocking, and neighbors gathered with rifles, demanding answers. But when raiders returned under cover of night, the truth blazed like fire. These women weren't helpless, they were defenders, healers, and a family he never expected. Now the question thunders like hoofbeats across the frontier. Will this lonely cowboy's act of kindness bring redemption to a broken land, or will prejudice and fear tear everything apart? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The winter wind howled across the Colorado highlands, its icy fingers, searching for any gap in Mark Boone's weathered cabin walls. He sat alone at his rough-hewn table, a tin plate of beans and salt pork before him. The lamp flame wavered, casting dancing shadows across the empty chairs his wife Sarah had once painted yellow to bring some sunshine inside. Mark's massive frame bent over his plate as he bowed his head. "Lord," he whispered, his deep voice barely carrying over the wind's moan, "thank you for this food." He paused, as he always did, leaving space for words that wouldn't come. 10 years. And prayer still felt hollow without Sarah's gentle voice joining his. The spoon clinked against the tin as he ate, each bite mechanical. Outside, snow began to fall, thick flakes visible through the window's frosted panes. His thoughts drifted to the day's work, mending fences in the bitter cold, checking on the cattle huddled in the lee of the ridge, his hands rough as oak. Bark still ached from the frozen hammer handle. The cabin creaked and settled, a sound as familiar as his own breathing. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a spray of sparks. Mark's eyes traveled to Sarah's Bible on the shelf, its leather cover worn smooth by hands now still. The silence pressed in, heavy as a wool blanket. Then came the pounding dot. Mark froze, fork halfway to his mouth. The harsh rapping came again, desperate and urgent. His chair scraped back as he stood, reaching for the Winchester mounted above the door. In 10 years, no one had come calling after nightfall, especially not in a gathering. "Storm, who's there?" he called, voice firm despite his racing heart. The answer came in a chorus of female voices, their words muffled by the thick door and howling wind. Mark could hear fear in their tone, a trembling urgency that made his grip tighten on the rifle. Slowly, he drew back the bolt and opened the door, keeping the Winchester ready. The sight before him made him lower the barrel immediately. 12 young women stood huddled in the swirling snow, their dark hair and traditional Apache clothing dusted, white with frost. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion and cold, eyes wide with desperation. Several swayed on their feet, and all bore the hollow-cheeked look of those who hadn't eaten in days. "Please," the oldest among them spoke, her English clear but accented. "Our village was burned. Raiders came. We walked many days in the mountains." She gestured to her companions, some of whom could barely stand. "Need shelter just until storm passes." Mark's mind raced. Harboring Apache women would set tongues. Wagging in town, some might call it improper. Others would say worse. The nearest settlement was 20 miles away. These women wouldn't survive the night in this weather. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his memory. "The Lord asks us to be neighbors to all." "Come in," he said, stepping back from the door. "Hurry, now, before more snow blows in." They filed past him, moving with the quiet grace of deer despite their exhaustion. Mark bolted the door behind them, then moved to the fireplace. "Gather round," he said, adding several logs to the flames. "Need to get you warm." The women huddled close to the fire, their shivering visible beneath their frost-covered clothes. Mark strode to the bedroom, returning with every blanket he owned, including Sarah's cherished quilts stored so carefully in the cedar chest. "Here," he said, distributing them. "Wrap up tight." He moved to the kitchen area, pulling out his biggest pot. "I'll make soup. Strong soup with plenty of beans and dried beef. It'll warm you from the inside." As he worked, the women began to speak softly among themselves in Apache, their voices creating a gentle murmur that filled the cabin's lonely corners. The sound of multiple heartbeats, multiple breaths, seemed to wake something long dormant in the old cabin's bones. Mark glanced over his shoulder as he stirred the pot. The women had arranged themselves in a circle, sharing blankets, helping each other warm their hands and feet. The oldest one, she couldn't have been more than 25, was checking the others for signs of frostbite. "It'll be ready soon," he said, adding another handful of dried vegetables to the soup. The familiar motions of cooking for others felt strange, like flexing a muscle long unused. "There's plenty for everyone." One of the younger women smiled at him, the first smile he'd seen, and nodded in thanks. Another began humming softly, a melody that spoke of distant mountains and summer winds. Soon others joined in, their voices twining together like smoke rising from the chimney. The cabin, so long silent, save for the wind and his own thoughts, now thrummed with life. The walls seemed to lean in, embracing the warmth and voices. Even the storm's howl seemed less lonely, less fierce. Mark ladled the hot soup into every bowl he owned, plus a few tin cups when the bowls ran out. He passed them around carefully, making sure each woman received a full portion. They accepted the food with murmured thanks, some touching their hearts in gratitude as they ate. Mark settled into his chair by the fire, the Winchester propped in the corner, close enough if needed, but no longer in his hands. The soup's steam rose like prayers in the firelight, and the sound of spoons against bowls mixed with soft conversation. For the first time in years, Mark felt the cabin become what it was meant to be, not just shelter from the storm, but a home where hearts could warm themselves back to life. He watched the women sharing blankets and soup, their faces softening as warmth and food began to ease their fear. The oldest one caught his eye and spoke again. "We are grateful." Many would turn away Apache women in the night. Mark's response came from somewhere deep and true. "My wife taught me every soul-seeking shelter is a neighbor." He paused, the words feeling right in his mouth. "You're safe here, long as you need." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Mark Boone's cabin, something frozen had begun to thaw. The fire crackled, voices murmured, and in the corners where shadows once gathered, light and life had returned. Mark woke before dawn, his habits unchanged despite the transformed cabin. Pale winter light crept through the frosted windows, casting weak shadows across the floor where his guests slept wrapped in quilts. The sight of them still startled him, 12 dark-haired heads resting peacefully, their breathing soft and steady. He moved quietly to the cook stove, careful not to wake them as he started the morning fire. The familiar routine of preparing breakfast felt different now, measuring out beans for 13 instead of 1. The pot was his biggest, yet he wondered if it would be enough. As the beans began to simmer, the women stirred. They rose without fuss, folding blankets with careful hands. Their clothes, stiff with yesterday's frost, hung in patches around the cabin where they'd spread them to dry. Mark noticed how they moved with purpose, each helping the others, working together like a well-practiced dance. The oldest one, Lonnie, she'd said her name, approached him at the stove. "We help?" she asked, gesturing to the pot. Mark shook his head. "You eat first," he said firmly. "Then we can talk about what happened to bring you here." His voice was gentle, but left no room for argument. The women gathered around his table, some sitting on chairs, others on blankets on the floor. Mark served them each a full bowl, then stepped back to let them eat. He watched as they blessed the food in their own way, heads bowed, hands linked. Their whispered words in Apache filled the kitchen with a melody he'd never heard before. Only after they'd eaten did Lonnie begin their story. Her English came slowly, carefully chosen words, painting a picture of terror and loss. "Raiders came at night," she said, her dark eyes distant. "Set fire to everything. Many died. We ran to mountains." She touched the arm of a younger woman beside her. "My sister, cousins, friends. We walked many days, no food left. Then storm came." Mark listened, his heart heavy. He knew what some folks in town would say, that he was a fool to believe them, that he was asking for trouble. But looking at their faces, seeing the truth of their suffering written there, he couldn't turn them away. "What about soldiers?" he asked. "Will they come looking?" Lonnie's face tightened. "Soldiers blame Apache for all bad things. Say we raid. We steal, not true. But they not listen." Mark nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of the world to know she spoke truth. The weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy blanket. Helping these women would mark him in town, maybe forever. But the alternative was unthinkable. "Well," he said, standing up straight, "can't change any of that now. Best we can do is work with what we have." He gestured for them to follow him outside. The morning air bit sharp and clean. Mark showed them his small barn first, introducing them to his 2 horses and explaining about feeding times. Next came the lean-to, where he stored tools and supplies. Finally, he led them to the woodpile. "Winter's long up here," he explained, demonstrating how to split kindling. "Need to keep the fire fed." To his surprise, several of the women stepped forward immediately, taking up axes with familiar hands. "We know this work," Lonnie said, a small smile touching her lips. Apache women, not weak. Throughout the day, they proved her words true. They worked without complaint, splitting wood, carrying water, helping tend to the horses. Mark found himself repeatedly impressed by their quiet efficiency and willingness to help. They moved like people used to hard work and making do with little. As the sun began to set, the women gathered herbs from small pouches they carried. Mark watched, curious, as they added these to a pot of stew. The cabin filled with new smells. Sharp, earthy scents he didn't recognize, but found pleasant. "Medicine herbs," Lonnie explained, stirring the pot. "Keep strength, help heal." She offered him the first bowl, but Mark insisted they serve themselves first. After the meal, as darkness pressed against the windows, the women began to sing. Their voices rose and fell like wind through pine needles, soft and sure. Mark sat in his chair by the fire, listening. The chant spoke of things he couldn't understand, but their beauty needed no translation. Something inside him began to unlock, like a door long rusted shut. The peace in their songs reached past his defenses, touching a place in his heart he'd thought frozen since Sarah's death. He found himself breathing easier, as if a weight he hadn't known he carried had lifted slightly. The women's faces glowed in the firelight as they sang, their features soft with remembrance and hope. Despite everything they'd lost, they still had this, their songs, their traditions, their connection to each other. Mark realized they were sharing something precious with him, a gift freely given. Later, as the fire burned low and the women prepared for sleep, Lonnie touched his arm lightly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing us, for helping." Mark nodded, unable to find words. But as he watched them settle into their blankets, saw how they arranged themselves to protect the youngest ones, he knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever consequences came from town, he would face them. These women needed shelter, and his cabin needed life. Perhaps the Lord had sent them to each other for reasons neither yet understood. The peace their songs had brought lingered in his heart as he checked the doors one last time. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, the cabin felt more like home than it had in years. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm, like the steady beat of hoofbeats across open prairie. Mark rose each morning to find the women already awake, tending the fire or quietly mending clothes. Their presence filled his cabin with a warmth that went beyond the crackling hearth. Creeks best before sun rises, Mark explained one crisp morning, leading several of the women through knee-deep snow. His boots crunched patterns in the fresh powder while they followed, wrapped in borrowed blankets. Ice is thinner then, easier to break through. He demonstrated how to test the ice's strength, where to look for the deepest pools, and how to fill buckets without getting soaked. The women watched intently, then took turns practicing. Their quick hands and sure feet surprised him. They learned faster than he could teach. Water heavy, Lonnie observed, helping a younger woman balance to full buckets. But good exercise. She smiled, a rare sight that transformed her serious face. In the barn, Mark showed them how to milk his small herd of cows. The animals seemed to take to their new caretakers naturally, standing quietly as inexperienced hands learned the proper rhythm. Soon enough, several of the women could fill a pail as quickly as Mark himself. "Gentle hands make happy cows," he said, watching them work. Just like my Sarah always said. The mention of his wife's name didn't hurt as much as it used to. Something about sharing her wisdom with others made the memory sweeter. The women brought their own knowledge too. One afternoon, Lonnie noticed Mark rubbing his shoulder after chopping wood. She returned from the forest with a handful of bark and leaves, brewing them into a strong-smelling tea. "Medicine for pain," she explained, pressing the steaming cup into his hands. "From willow tree, our mothers taught us." The tea tasted bitter, but brought blessed relief to his aching muscles. Mark found himself learning more each day: which plants could heal, which could harm, how to read the weather in the cloud shapes. The women's understanding of the land ran deep as tree roots. They taught him their crafts as well. In the evenings, they would gather around the fire, showing him how to work softened deer hide into moccasins. His huge fingers felt clumsy with the delicate needle, but they guided him patiently. Like this, one of the younger women demonstrated her stitches, tiny and even. Strong seam keeps water out. The cabin grew crowded with 13 souls sharing the space, but somehow they made it work. The women slept close together for warmth, sharing blankets and stories in soft voices. During the day, they found ways to help, cooking, cleaning, repairing clothes torn by hard work. Their presence filled the empty corners where loneliness had lived. Laughter began to echo off the walls, starting as quiet chuckles and growing into real mirth. Mark found himself smiling more often, remembering how to share jokes and simple pleasures. The sound of multiple voices speaking and singing made the cabin feel alive again. One evening, as they finished a meal of venison stew and cornbread, Lonnie's eyes fell on the Bible that sat on Mark's shelf. She reached for it carefully, running her fingers over its worn leather cover. "You read this?" she asked, opening it with gentle hands. Mark nodded. "Every night, once upon a time." "Haven't much lately." He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how long it had been. "Read now," Lonnie requested, holding the book out to him. The other women gathered closer, their faces curious and attentive. Mark took the Bible with trembling hands. He opened to a familiar passage, one Sarah had loved. "The Lord is my shepherd," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "I shall not want." The words of Psalm 23 filled the cabin, and Mark's voice grew stronger with each verse. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. As he read, memories of Sarah reading these same words flooded back. Her voice had been clear and sweet, full of conviction. His own voice cracked with emotion, but he pressed on, drawing strength from the attentive faces around him. When he finished, silence held for a moment. Then, softly at first, the women began to hum. Their prayer songs rose like smoke, weaving through the air in haunting harmony. Mark sat still, listening as to different forms of worship merged and danced together. The songs spoke of earth and sky, of the Great Spirit's power and mercy. Though he couldn't understand the words, their meaning touched his heart. He found himself humming along, adding his deep voice to their melody. That night, sleep came easier than it had in years. The familiar words of Scripture mixed with new songs in his dreams, creating something beautiful and unexpected. When dawn painted the sky pink the next morning, Mark walked to his barn feeling changed. The morning chores waited, as always: animals to feed, ice to break, work to be done. But now each task had purpose beyond mere survival. Standing in the barn's doorway, watching his breath mist in the cold air, Mark felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's passing: gratitude. Not just for the help the women provided, though that was welcome. No, he felt grateful for being needed again, for having people to care for and teach, for the way they taught him in return. Their presence had brought life back to his world, filling it with songs and stories, wisdom and warmth. Together, they were becoming something new, not quite a traditional family, but a community bound by trust and shared needs. Mark bowed his head, offering silent thanks for this unexpected gift. A week passed swiftly, marked by shared work and growing trust. Mark noticed the flour barrel growing light as he scooped out the morning's biscuits. The salt pork hung sparse in his smokehouse, and the lamp oil had dwindled to a finger's depth. Winter stretched ahead, demanding preparation. He found Lonnie splitting kindling by the woodpile, her steady strokes precise and sure. "Need to make a supply run," he said, watching frost curl from his words. "Wagon'll take most of a day to town and back." Lonnie straightened, resting the axe handle against her leg. "We come too," she said firmly. "Have things to trade." She gestured toward the cabin where the women had spent evenings working on intricate beadwork by Firelight. Mark hesitated. The town's reaction worried him. Folks weren't kind to those they didn't understand, but the determined set of Lonnie's jaw told him argument would be useless. These women had survived worse than small-town prejudice. "Reckon that's fair," he agreed. Finally, "Best hitch up early tomorrow. Beat the worst of the cold." Dawn found them loading the wagon, breath steaming in the pale light. Mark had insisted they take every blanket he owned, wrapping the women in layers against the bitter wind. The horses stamped impatiently, their flanks already starting to steam in the cold. The journey through the snowy passes was slow going. Mark kept the team to a steady walk, mindful of ice hidden beneath the powder. The wagon creaked and swayed, its wooden wheels breaking through crusty drifts. The women huddled together in back, sharing warmth and quiet conversation by mid-morning. The town's scattered buildings came into view. Mark felt tension creep into his shoulders as they approached. The street was busy with Saturday traffic. Ranchers in for supplies, families heading to the general store, cowboys lounging outside the saloon. Heads turned as Mark guided the wagon down Main Street. Conversation died, replaced by pointed silence and hard stares. He heard the whispers start, carried on the winter wind. "Look there. That's Boone's wagon. Heard he's taken in 12 squaws up at his place. Ain't natural. Man living alone with savages." A few men spat in the dirt as the wagon passed, their faces dark with judgment. Mark kept his eyes forward, jaw set, though his hands tightened on the reins. The women sat straight-backed and dignified. Refusing to shrink from the hostile gazes, he pulled up in front of Harper's General Store, helping the women down from the wagon with careful courtesy. Mrs. Sarah Harper stood in the doorway, her kind face creased with interest rather than scorn. "Welcome, Mr. Boone," she called, nodding to include the women in her greeting. "Quite a day for traveling, ma'am." Mark touched his hat brim. "Need some provisions, if you're stocked. Come in, come." In Mrs. Harper ushered them inside, where warmth from the pot-bellied stove drove back the chill. "Land's sake, you must be frozen through." The store shelves stretched ceiling-high, packed with everything from harness leather to bolts of calico. While Mark listed his needs, flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, one of the younger women stepped forward shyly. She held out a deerskin pouch to Mrs. Harper. Inside lay delicate beadwork, belts, and bracelet bands, worked in intricate patterns of blue and white. Mrs. Harper's eyes widened with genuine appreciation. "Why, these are lovely," she breathed, running careful fingers over the beadwork. "Such fine stitching, I've never seen the like." The woman smiled, pointing to different designs and explaining their meaning in halting English. Soon Mrs. Harper was showing her the store's selection of beads and thread, discussing patterns and techniques like old friends. The exchange seemed to break some invisible barrier. A few curious children drifted closer, drawn by the women's bright blankets and long braids. One little girl reached out to touch a beaded fringe, then giggled when the woman showed her how the patterns caught the light. Mark watched from near the counter, warmth spreading in his chest as he saw the women's dignity winning over at least some of the town's prejudice. Mrs. Harper's acceptance carried weight as the minister's sister and a respected figure in the community. Her example might help others see past their fears, but not everyone was won over so easily. As Mark loaded the supplies into his wagon, he noticed Cole Haskett, owner of the big Triple Bar Ranch, watching from across the street. The rancher's face was set in hard lines, his eyes cold as the winter wind. "Soldiers won't like this, Boone," Haskett called out, his voice carrying clearly in the frozen air. "Army's particular about Indians staying where they're put." Mark straightened to his full height, using his considerable size to advantage. "These women needed help," he said quietly. "Ain't no law against Christian charity." Haskett's lip curled. "There's charity, and there's asking for trouble. Best watch yourself." He turned and strode away, spurs jingling with each aggressive step. The ride home was quieter, everyone lost in thought. But Mark noticed the women sat taller, carried themselves. With fresh pride, they had faced the town's judgment and found small kindnesses among the scorn. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was a beginning. The winter sun was setting as they pulled up to the cabin, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. As Mark helped unload supplies, he caught Lonnie's eye and saw his own quiet satisfaction mirrored there. They had made the journey together and come home stronger for it. The other women were already starting supper, their voices mixing with the familiar sounds of his homestead. Mark paused in the doorway, watching them move about his cabin with growing confidence. Whatever trouble might come, he knew he'd made the right choice that snowy night, when he opened his door to strangers and found family instead. The evening settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, muffling the world beyond, their walls in deepening snow. Mark stoked the fire, adding another log while watching the women prepare supper. The familiar aromas of beans and cornbread filled the warm air, mingling with the sharp scent of pine smoke. His thoughts kept drifting back to Haskett's warning. Words in town. The rancher's threat hung over him like storm clouds, dark with promise. Mark had lived long enough in these parts to know how quickly whispered words could turn to violence. "Food ready," Lonnie called, breaking through his brooding. The women had arranged themselves around the long table, leaving his usual place at the head empty. Steam rose from wooden bowls as they passed around the evening meal. Before eating, the youngest of the women, Sarah, was how she asked to be called, approached Mark with something clutched in her hands. She held out a bracelet woven from horsehair and decorated with tiny wooden beads, carefully carved and polished. "For you," she said softly. "Thank you for sharing home." One by one, the other women presented their own gifts. More bracelets. A belt decorated with porcupine quills. Even a leather pouch embroidered with dyed porcupine quills in patterns of dancing deer. Each item spoke of hours of patient work, crafted in the quiet moments between chores. Mark's throat tightened as he accepted each gift. "Much obliged," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Ain't necessary, but I thank you all the same." Lonnie smiled, the firelight catching the silver threads in her dark hair. "Family shares," she said simply. "Makes good medicine for lonely hearts." The words struck deep. Mark hadn't thought of himself as lonely anymore. He'd grown too used to solitude. But watching these women transform his quiet cabin into a home full of life and laughter, he realized how empty it had been before. A burst of merry chatter filled the room as they began to eat. Mark found himself smiling at their animated discussions, even though he could only catch fragments of meaning. The cabin felt alive, warmed by more than just the crackling fire. The sharp rap of knuckles on wood cut through their contentment like a knife. Mark's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle before he caught himself. The women fell silent, their faces tight with fear. Another knock followed, more insistent. "Stay calm," Mark murmured, rising slowly from his chair. He moved to the door, uncomfortably aware of 12 pairs of worried eyes following his every step. The door swung open to reveal Sheriff Tom Cawley, snow-dusting his broad shoulders. His badge caught the lamplight as he stepped inside, removing his hat. "Evening, Mark," the lawman said quietly. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene. The women gathered at the table, the remains of their shared meal. The gifted craftwork still laid out on Mark's chair. "Tom," Mark's greeting was cautious. He'd known the sheriff for years, counted him as fair-minded, but tonight he couldn't read the man's expression. "Need to have a word," Callie said, gesturing toward the door. "Private-like." Mark nodded, reaching for his coat. "Ladies, excuse me a moment." He followed the sheriff out onto the porch, where their breath frosted in the cold air. Callie leaned against the railing, choosing his words carefully. "Words spreading fast about your guests. People are saying you're keeping 12 squaws under your roof. Giving shelter through winter is all," Mark said firmly. "They lost everything to raiders. Couldn't turn them away to freeze. Ain't about what's right, Mark. It's about what folks believe." The sheriff sighed, his face weathered with concern. "Army post'll take notice soon enough. They don't cotton to Indians straying from assigned territories. These women ain't causing trouble. They work hard. Trade fair. You can ask Sarah Harper about that. I believe you." Cawley's voice held sympathy, but his next words were heavy. "With duty. But there's them that'll say you're harboring hostiles. Times being what they are, that kind of talk can turn dangerous." Mark straightened to his full height, looking down at the sheriff. "You saying I should turn them out? In winter? I'm saying be careful." Callie settled his hat back on his head. "I'll do what I can to keep peace, but I can't stop the army if they decide to take interest." They both knew what that meant. The Army's interest rarely ended well for Native people, no matter how peaceful their intentions. "Much obliged for the warning," Mark said stiffly, "but I ain't turning them out. Not while I still draw breath." Callie nodded, as if he'd expected no less. Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away into the darkness, leaving only hoofprints in the fresh snow, when Mark returned inside. He found the women huddled together, their earlier joy replaced by familiar fear. Lonnie stood at their center, straight-backed but with tension in every line of her body. "Soldiers come?" she asked quietly. "Not tonight," Mark assured them. "Sheriff just warning us that folks are talking." "We go," one of the older women said. "Better than bring trouble to kind man." "No." Mark's voice was firm. "This is your home now, long as you need it. Won't nobody drive you out, not townsfolk, not soldiers, not nobody." He moved to the fire, adding another log with deliberate care. "My wife used to say, home ain't just for walls and a roof. It's where folks look after each other, where there's trust and respect." He turned to face them, his expression gentle but determined. "You're welcome here. Don't matter what anyone else thinks about it." Slowly, the tension began to ease from their shoulders. The women exchanged glances, speaking quietly in their own language. Finally, Lonnie stepped forward and touched Mark's arm lightly. "You good man," she said simply. "We face trouble together." The others nodded, and gradually they returned to their places at the table. The laughter didn't return that night. But something deeper took its place, a quiet determination, a shared resolve to face whatever came their way as family. Mark sat in his chair by the fire, his fingers tracing the intricate beadwork of their gifts. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. But inside the cabin, warmth held steady, built on something stronger than wood and flame. Heavy snow draped the mountains like a thick white blanket, sealing Mark's homestead in pristine silence. The drifts piled high against the cabin walls, turning windows into frames of delicate frost patterns for 3 days straight. The world beyond the property line disappeared entirely. Mark stood at the door, studying the white expanse. "Reckon we need more firewood to weather this spell," he said, mostly to himself. The woodpile, though substantial, wouldn't last forever with 13 people to keep warm. Lonnie appeared at his shoulder, her dark eyes assessing the situation. "We help," she stated firmly. It wasn't a question. Within the hour, Mark had shown the women how to craft simple wooden sleds from spare planks and rope. His large hands demonstrated the proper knots, weaving the hemp into secure crosses. "Like this," he explained, pulling the rope tight. "Holds better in the snow." The women proved quick studies. Soon 6 sleds were ready, their runners smooth to glide easier. Mark watched with approval as they worked together, their movements efficient and purposeful. There was no complaint about the cold or the work ahead. "Now for the hauling," Mark said, leading them to a stand of dead timber he'd marked earlier in the season. He demonstrated how to stack the logs on the sleds, showing them the trick of distributing weight evenly. The women nodded, immediately grasping the principle. They worked through the morning, their breath clouding in the frigid air. The younger women dragged the laden sleds, while the older ones helped guide them through the deeper drifts. Mark walked alongside, ready to assist, but found they rarely needed his help. Their strength and determination impressed him. By midday, they had doubled the size of the woodpile. Mark insisted they break for food and warmth. Inside the cabin, wonderful smells greeted them. Some of the women had stayed behind to prepare a meal. Combining Mark's stored provisions with their own carefully rationed supplies, steam rose from a pot of beans simmered with bacon, while another pot held a thick soup made from dried corn and wild herbs the women had gathered before the snow. The blending of their food traditions had become natural now, each contributing what they could to their shared table as they ate. Mark attempted to pronounce some Apache words the women had been teaching him. His clumsy efforts brought peals of laughter, but it was gentle mirth, free of mockery. In turn, they tried copying his slow drawl, turning much obliged into a musical phrase that made him grin. The afternoon passed in similar fashion, working, resting, sharing what they knew. Mark found himself talking more than he had in years, answering their curious questions about his life, his land, his ways. Their interests seemed genuine, their respect for his knowledge matched by their eagerness to share their own. When evening settled in, they gathered around the fire, as had become their custom. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending occasional drafts down the chimney, but inside remained cozy and warm. The women worked on various projects, beadwork, mending, weaving, while Mark cleaned his tools. In the comfortable quiet, Lonnie's voice rose soft but clear. "Your woman," she said carefully, gesturing at the worn Bible that always sat near Mark's chair. She read this. Mark's hands stilled on the leather he was oiling. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind's moan. The other women looked up from their work, sensing the weight of the moment. "Yes," he finally answered, his voice rough. Every evening, near about, said it gave her peace. Lonnie nodded slowly, her eyes gentle. "You miss her voice." The question pierced straight to his heart. Mark found himself speaking of things he hadn't shared in years, how Sarah had taught the local children, how she loved singing hymns while she worked, how fever had taken her one harsh winter despite all his desperate prayers. "Been 8 years. Now," he said quietly. "Sometimes I still wake thinking I hear her humming." The cabin fell silent, but it wasn't the empty silence he'd lived with for so long. This silence held understanding, shared knowledge of loss. Several of the women nodded, their own eyes distant with memories. Then one of the older women began to sing, her voice low and melodious. Others joined in, weaving a song that seemed to embrace both sorrow and comfort. Though Mark couldn't understand the words, their meaning reached him clear as spring water. Lonnie translated softly, "Song for those who walk ahead of us. Says their love stays, like stars stay, even in daylight when we cannot see them." Mark felt moisture on his cheeks and didn't try to hide it. The women's voices wrapped around him like a warm blanket, acknowledging his pain while somehow making it easier to bear. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt his grief being held by others who understood, who offered comfort without trying to erase his loss. When the song ended, no one spoke for a long while. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the wind continued its lonely howl, but it seemed less threatening now, less empty. Finally, the youngest of the women rose and added another log to the fire. Others resumed their quiet work. Life continued, as it must, but something had shifted. Mark's grief, so long held private, had been witnessed and honored. In sharing it, he found it weighed less heavily. He looked around the cabin at these women who had become so much more than guests. They had brought life back to his home, yes. But more than that, they had helped him remember how to live in the company of others, how to share not just food and shelter, but the deeper things that made a home truly warm. The evening deepened into night. Snow continued to fall outside, but inside the cabin, 13 hearts beat in peaceful rhythm, bound together by trust and understanding that grew stronger with each passing day. The morning dawned bright and clear, the storm's fury spent at last. Sunlight sparkled on fresh snow, and the air held that special crispness that came after winter storms. Mark stood on his porch, breathing deep the clean mountain air. The cloudless sky promised good weather, at least for today. Time to stock. Up on water, he announced to the women gathering behind him. Creek should be running clear now. They followed him to the barn where he kept his ice-cutting tools. Mark demonstrated how to use the long saw and heavy picks, showing them the careful motions needed to break through the frozen creek surface. The women watched intently, asking questions in their mix of Apache and English. "Ice thick," Lonnie observed, testing the creek surface with her boot. "Needs strong arms." Mark nodded. "That we do, But many hands make lighter work. They organized themselves efficiently, some wielding the tools while others prepared to haul the water barrels. Mark showed them how to position themselves safely on the creek bank, explaining the dangers of thin ice. To his approval, they took turns at the harder tasks, switching out before anyone grew too tired. The work was demanding, but the women approached it with determination. Their breaths came out in white puffs as they sawed through the ice, creating holes large enough to dip buckets. The sound of metal striking ice echoed through the quiet valley. "Watch how the water moves under the ice," Mark advised, pointing to dark shapes flowing beneath the frozen surface. "Tells you where it's safest to cut." As they worked, Mark noticed how the women communicated with subtle gestures and quick glances, coordinating their efforts without need for many words. They had clearly worked together this way before, and their teamwork impressed him. They had filled half the barrels when Lonnie suddenly stiffened, her eyes scanning the tree line. The other women paused their work, alert to her change in posture. Mark followed their gaze and saw what had caught their attention: tracks in the snow, circling wide around his pasture. "Wolf tracks," he said grimly, kneeling to examine the prints. "Fresh ones, made since the storm passed." The women gathered close, studying the marks with knowing eyes. One of the older women, Swift River, spoke rapidly in Apache. Lonnie translated. "She says, many wolves. Hungry ones. They watch the cattle." Mark straightened, his expression serious. "Best finish up here quick and get back to check on the livestock." They worked with renewed purpose, filling the remaining barrels and securing them on the sleds. The return trip to the cabin was tense, everyone watching the shadows between the trees. Mark's hand stayed close to his rifle. The day passed without incident, but as dusk approached, Mark made sure the cattle were secured in the barn. He added extra boards across the door and checked his ammunition. The women watched his preparations with understanding in their eyes. Night fell early, as it did in winter. They had just finished their evening meal when the first howl echoed across the valley. 'Twas answered by another, then another, a whole pack, calling to each other as they moved closer to the homestead. Mark grabbed his rifle and headed for the door. "Stay inside," he ordered. "I'll handle this." But the women were already moving. Lonnie stepped forward, her face set with determination. "We know wolves," she said firmly. "We help." Before Mark could protest, they were gathering torches and kindling. Moving with practiced efficiency, they began setting up a ring of fire around the barn. Some drove tall stakes into the snow, while others wrapped cloth around the tops and soaked them with lamp oil. Mark watched in amazement as they created a defensive circle of light. The wolves' howls grew closer, but the women showed no fear. They lit the torches one by one until the barn was surrounded by a barrier of flickering flames. The pack appeared at the edge of the firelight, lean, hungry shapes with gleaming eyes. Mark raised his rifle, but Lonnie touched his arm. "Wait," she said. "Watch." The women spread out between the torches, moving in a coordinated dance. They began to shout and sing, their voices rising strong and fierce in the night air. They clapped their hands and stamped their feet, creating a rhythm that seemed to shake the very ground. The wolves hesitated, confused by this display of strength and noise. The women's shouts grew louder, and they began striking their torches against the ground, sending showers of sparks into the air. The effect was both beautiful and terrifying. 12 fierce figures outlined in fire, their shadows dancing giant-like against the snow. Mark stood transfixed, his rifle lowered. He had never seen anything like it. These were not the helpless refugees who had appeared at his door that stormy night. These were warriors, defending their home with courage and skill. The wolves began to retreat, slinking backward into the darkness. Still, the women kept up their demonstration until the last howl faded into distance. Only then did they lower their torches, their faces glowing with triumph. "That was something to see," Mark said, shaking his head in wonder. "Never would have thought of using fire that way." Lonnie smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "Our mothers taught us. Wolves respect strength, respect fire. Show them we are stronger, they go away." The other women gathered around, their excitement evident in their quick words and gestures. They had protected the homestead, their home now too, and done it their own way. Mark saw in their faces the same fierce joy he felt after a job well done. "Reckon I've been thinking about this all wrong," he admitted. "Been worried about protecting you, when truth is, you're as capable as any I've ever seen." The women's smiles grew wider at his words. Swift River said something that made the others laugh, and Lonnie translated. "She says you are learning slow. Like winter sun, but learning." Mark laughed too, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying torches. These women had proved themselves not just survivors, but protectors. They had turned his lonely homestead into something more, a place where different kinds of strength could work together. They gathered the torches and headed back to the cabin, leaving the fire ring burning low to discourage any wolves thinking of returning. The night was cold but clear, stars sharp as ice overhead. Mark walked behind the women, watching them talk and laugh together, and felt a deep respect settling in his heart. They had faced down wolves with nothing but fire and courage, and they had won. Inside the cabin, they hung their snow-dampened clothes by the fire and settled in for the night, the excitement of the evening still humming in the air. Mark looked around at their familiar faces, seeing them with new eyes. These were not charges to be protected, but allies to be valued. Partners in the hard work of survival. The wolves' howls had faded to silence, driven away by the strength of women who knew how to defend what was theirs. Mark reckoned there was still plenty they could teach him. If he was wise enough to learn, Mark studied their dwindling supplies with a furrowed brow. The flour barrel echoed hollow when he tapped. It and the salt pork was down to its last few strips. Though spring felt distant, hidden behind endless snow, they needed to make another trip to town. "We trade this time," Lonnie said, spreading colorful beadwork across the rough wooden table. Her sisters and cousins had worked through many evenings, creating intricate patterns that caught the lamplight. Woven belts, soft as silk despite their strength, lay beside pouches of dried herbs they had gathered before the snows. Mark nodded, impressed by their industry. "Reckon Mrs. Harper might be interested. She's got an eye for fine work." The next morning, they loaded the wagon carefully, wrapping the crafts in oiled cloth to protect them from the wet snow. The women climbed aboard, their dark hair gleaming beneath wool scarves. Mark noticed how they held themselves straighter, now more confident than during their first trip to town. The journey was slow but peaceful. Snow had packed down on the trail, making the going easier than last time. Still, their breath frosted in the air, and the women huddled close for warmth. At the mercantile, Mrs. Harper's face lit up when they unveiled their wares. "My word," she breathed, running her fingers over the beadwork. "Such delicate stitching. And these colors? Why, ladies, this is fine work indeed." The women smiled at her praise, explaining through Lonnie how each pattern held meaning. Mrs. Harper listened intently, asking questions about their techniques. Other customers drew closer, curious despite themselves. The peaceful moment shattered when rancher Cole Haskett's voice boomed from the doorway. "Selling Indian trinkets now, Sarah." He spat the words like they tasted bitter. "What next? Witch Doctor charms?" Mark's shoulders tensed, but he kept his voice level. "These ladies do honest work, Cole. No call for such talk." Before Cole could respond, a commotion erupted outside. A woman's scream cut through the winter air. "Tommy, someone help my Tommy." They rushed outside to find young Tommy Matthews, the rancher's son, collapsed in the snow. His mother knelt beside him, face white with fear. "He's burning up," she cried. "Been sick since morning, but now he won't wake." The boy's face was flushed. With fever, his breathing shallow. Folks gathered round, offering confused advice, but no one knew what to do. The doctor was 2 days' ride away. Lonnie stepped forward, her movement catching Mrs. Matthews' desperate eyes. "I help," she said softly. "No medicine for fever." "Don't you let that savage touch my boy," Cole shouted, but Mrs. Matthews grabbed Lonnie's sleeve. "Please," she whispered, "help him." Lonnie knelt in the snow, her hands gentle as she examined. "Tommy," she spoke rapidly to her sisters, who hurried to the wagon. They returned with herbs and clean cloth. Working quickly, Lonnie made a poultice, explaining through broken English as she worked. "Fever plant," she said, crushing dried leaves. "Good medicine, cool blood, help breathing." Milk watched as she placed the poultice on Tommy's chest and forehead. The boy's mother hovered close, hope warring with fear on her face. Cole and other ranchers stood back, muttering darkly, but no one interfered. "Take inside," Lonnie instructed. "Keep warm. Keep warm. Give tea. When? Wake." She handed Mrs. Matthews a small packet of herbs with careful instructions. They carried Tommy into the mercantile, laying him on Mrs. Harper's cot in the back room. Hours crept by. The women took turns sitting with him, singing soft songs in Apache while his mother held his hand as sunset painted the snow pink. Tommy's eyes fluttered open. His fever had broken. "Mama," he called weakly. "I'm thirsty." Joy transformed Mrs. Matthews' face. She hugged her son, tears flowing freely. But when she turned to thank Lonnie, she found only empty air. The women had slipped away quietly, sensing it was safer to leave without ceremony. Mark found them waiting by the wagon, their faces troubled. They had heard the whispers, starting how the Apache women had used heathen charms and dark magic to cure the boy. Never mind that they had seen every herb used, watched every step of the healing. Fear turned medicine into witchcraft in their minds. "Ain't right," Mark said quietly, helping them into the wagon. "You saved that boy's life." Lonnie's eyes were sad but unsurprised. Some people fear what they do not understand. "Better we go now." As they drove away, Mark heard Cole Haskett's voice rising above the crowd. "Mark Boone's pet Indians are probably the ones who made that boy sick in the first place. Probably cursed him just to show off their devil's magic." Mark's jaw clenched, tight, his knuckles white on the reins. He wanted to turn back, to confront Cole's ignorance with his fists. T felt Lonnie's hand touch his arm. Gentle but firm. "No fight," she said softly. "Take us home." The ride back was silent, heavy with unspoken words. The women huddled together. Their earlier confidence dimmed, but not destroyed. They had done what was right, used their knowledge to save a child. If others turned that kindness into something dark, that was not their burden to bear. As the cabin came into view, Mark finally spoke. "I'm proud of what you did today. Don't let their fear change your hearts." The women nodded, understanding in their eyes. They had faced such fears before, would likely face them again. But they would keep their medicine, their crafts, their dignity. They would continue to help where they could, heal where they could, even when kindness was repaid with suspicion. Together, they unloaded the wagon as evening settled over the homestead. The cabin welcomed them back with warmth and familiar smells. Here, at least, they could be themselves, neither savages nor saints. Just people trying to live with honor in a hard world. 3 days after Tommy Matthews' healing, Mark heard them before he saw them. The thunder of hooves and angry voices carried across the snow-covered valley to his cabin. He had been expecting this, knowing the rumors would eventually bring violence to his door. "Get inside," he told the women, who were helping him repair a broken chair on the porch. They moved, swiftly, gathering their tools and disappearing into the cabin's warmth. Through the window, he saw Lonnie organizing the others, moving them away from the windows. Her face calm, but her eyes alert. Mark took his position by the door, Winchester rifle resting easily in his broad hands. He wasn't aiming, not yet, but the weapon's presence sent a clear message. The approaching riders would understand its meaning. The mob crested the hill, 15 men at least, with Cole Haskett at their head. Their horses' flanks were dark with sweat despite the cold, showing how hard they'd ridden. Mark recognized most of them: ranchers, storekeepers, men he'd known for years. Good men, usually, when fear wasn't driving them. Cole reined in his horse, 20 paces from the cabin, his face flushed with more than just the winter wind. "Boone," he shouted, "bring them squaws out. Army's gonna want to question them about them raids down south." Mark didn't move from his position. His voice carried, clearly across the yard, measured and firm. "No raids down here, Cole. These women lost their village. They're under my protection." Protection. Cole spat into the snow, more like harboring criminals. "We all know Indians been hitting settlements. How do we know these ain't scouts for a war party?" "Because I know them," Mark replied. "They're peaceful folk. Done nothing but honest work since they arrived." Honest work. Another rider pushed forward, Sam Tucker, whose cattle had been rustled last fall. Like that witch doctoring they did on Tommy Matthews. Boy ain't been right since. Mark's jaw tightened. Tommy Matthews is alive because of their medicine. Would have died of fever otherwise. Rather, he'd died clean than lived cursed, Cole shouted. Several men nodded, and Mark saw hands tightening on rifle stocks. "They ain't leaving," Mark said simply. "My word on it." Cole's face darkened. "Your word." "Your word ain't law, Boone. We got a right to protect our families. Hey, and I've got a right to protect mine." The word hung in the winter air. Family, Mark. Hadn't planned to say it, but he realized it was true. These women, with their quiet strength and gentle ways, had become his family. He'd die before he'd betray that trust. Gone soft in the head, Cole muttered, but uncertainty had crept in too. His voice. He knew Mark's reputation, knew the big man wasn't one for idle threats. The standoff might have turned ugly then. Toofbeats announced a new arrival. Sheriff Tom Coley rode up, his badge catching the pale sunlight. He looked tired, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "What's all this?" he asked, though he clearly knew. Cole turned in his saddle. "Sheriff, we come to help you take these Indians into custody. Armay'll want to question them about them raids." "What raids?" "Collies." Voice was patient but firm. "Ain't been no raids within 100 miles of here. You boys just working yourselves up over gossip? They bewitched Tommy Matthews." Sam Tucker insisted. "Tommy Matthews is home eating his mama's soup," the sheriff countered. "Doc rode out yesterday. Said the boy's fine. Just needed rest and good medicine." He looked pointedly at the assembled men, which is what those women gave him, near as I can tell. A murmur passed through the crowd. The sheriff's words carried weight, even with Cole's faction. "Still ain't right," Cole persisted. "Man living alone with 12 Indian women ain't natural. Ain't." "None of your business, neither," Collie said sharply. Then he sighed, turning to Mark. "But he's right about one thing, Mark. Army's gonna hear about this. I can give you 3 days before I have to make my report." After that, he spread his hands, indicating his helplessness against military authority. Mark nodded slowly. "Much." "Obliged, Tom. 3 days is fair." The sheriff turned back to the mob. "Now, you boys go on home. Ain't nothing here worth getting shot over." His hand rested meaningfully on his own holstered revolver. For a moment, Cole looked ready to argue. further. But the fight had gone out of the others. One by one, they turned their horses until only Cole remained. "This ain't over, Boone," he said quietly. "You're choosing Indians over your own kind. Won't forget that. My kind." Mark's voice was equally soft. "My kind's anybody who needs help and means no harm. You forgot that somewhere, Cole." Cole spat again and wheeled his horse around, spurring it perhaps harder than necessary. The mob's departure was less dramatic than their arrival, scattered. Groups of riders breaking off toward their own ranches. The sheriff lingered. 3 days, Mark. Best use them well." He touched his hat brim and rode away. Leaving Mark alone in the growing dusk dawned inside the cabin, the women emerged from their hiding places. They had heard everything. Mark saw it. In their faces, gratitude shone in their eyes, but fear lingered there too. They knew what it meant to be hunted. "Thank you," Lonnie said simply, the others nodding behind her. "You risk much for us?" Mark set his rifle carefully in its place by the door. Ain't no risk protecting what's right. But as they prepared supper that evening, a heavy silence filled the cabin. The usual gentle chatter was muted, replaced by worried glances and whispered conversations in Apache. Mark watched them work, knowing they were already planning what to do when the army came. 3 days. It wasn't much time, but it was something. Mark bowed his head over his plate, offering a silent prayer for guidance. When he looked up, he found Lonnie watching him with understanding in her dark eyes. "We pray too," she said softly. "For wisdom? For path ahead." Mark nodded, touched by her words. Whatever came next, they would face it together. This unlikely family forged in winter's heart. The army might be coming, but for now, they had this moment, this meal, this warm circle of light against the gathering dark. Outside, snow began to fall again, adding another layer to the white blanket covering the valley. Inside, the fire crackled. And slowly, tentatively, the women began to sing their evening songs. Their voices rose soft but unafraid, filling the cabin with hope despite the shadow of what was to come. The next morning dawned gray and heavy. Mark stood at his cabin door, watching frost crystals dance in the pale light. His Winchester rifle never left his side now. Every snap of a branch, every shadow at dusk, brought his hand to the weapon. Inside, the women moved with quiet purpose. They had survived raids before. They knew the signs, the waiting, the weight of coming violence. Mark watched them gather stones from the creek bed, stacking them near windows and doors. Their hands were quick, certain. These were not just rocks, they were weapons, protection, a way to fight back. "Good thinking," he said to Lonnie as she directed the youngest girls. "Stones might save our lives." She nodded, her dark eyes serious. "We learn. After raiders come first time, we learn many ways to fight." Throughout that first day, they worked together to strengthen the cabin's defenses. The women wove rope snares from horsehair and strips of leather, setting them in the deeper shadows where attackers might hide. Mark showed them how to block. Windows with furniture, leaving just enough space to shoot through by sunset. The cabin had become a fortress. But Mark's unease grew with the lengthening shadows. During supper, a quiet meal of beans and cornbread, he made a decision. "Time you learn to shoot," he said, bringing out his spare rifle. It was an old Sharps carbine, well-maintained but simpler than his Winchester. "Can't have just me defending the place." The women gathered round as he demonstrated how to load, aim, and fire. Their faces were solemn, but their hands were steady as they passed the rifle between them. Lonnie proved a quick study, her movements precise as she worked the action. "Like this?" she asked, bringing the rifle to her shoulder. "That's right." Mark nodded, But remember, squeeze the trigger gentle, like you're picking up an egg. Don't pull hard. They practiced until the light failed, using a fence post as a target. Most of the women showed natural skill, though some were too gentle with the trigger, others too rough. Mark felt pride in their determination, even as his heart ached that they needed to learn. That night, as wind whistled through the cabins, chinks, Lonnie picked up Mark's Bible. They had made this their evening ritual, sharing words of comfort from both their traditions. But tonight felt different, more urgent. "I read?" she asked, her finger tracing the familiar leather cover. Mark nodded, settling into his chair by the fire. The other women gathered close, some mending clothes, others working beads onto leather. Strips, but all listening. Lonnie opened to Psalms, where a piece of leather marked their place. Her voice came slow but clear. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Mark closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him. Her accent gave the familiar verse new music, like hearing it for the first time. When she finished, the cabin fell silent, except for the crackling fire. "Beautiful words," Lonnie said softly, "like our old songs, words of strength." Mark opened his eyes to find her watching him. "Reckon we need all the strength we can get." The second day passed much like the first. They reinforced their defenses, gathered more stones, practiced more with the rifle. But tension grew thick as storm clouds. Mark caught the women glancing, often toward the hills, their hands straying to the stones they'd gathered. That evening, they ate little. Even the youngest women, usually quick to smile, sat quiet and watchful. Mark led them in prayer before bed, their voices joining his in a whispered amen. The third night came black as pitch, with no moon to light the valley. Mark sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching darkness press against the glass. Behind him, most of the women slept, though fitfully. Lonnie kept watch with him, her back straight, eyes fixed on the night beyond. The sound came just before midnight, soft at first, like wind through pine needles. But Mark knew better. Those were hoofbeats, muffled by snow, trying to be quiet. "They come," Lonnie whispered, already moving to wake the others. Mark squinted into the darkness. Their pinpricks of light, bobbing between the trees. Torches carried low. He counted at least 8, maybe more. The women woke silently, taking their positions as they'd practiced. Some gathered stones. Others took up tools as weapons, axes, hoes, anything with weight and reach. The youngest crouched behind overturned tables, ready to reload weapons or fetch water if fire came. "Same raiders," Lonnie breathed, pressing close to the window. "I know their way of moving. They burned our village. Kill our men. Take what they want." Mark's grip tightened on his rifle. These weren't just bandits, then they were murderers. The worst kind of predators. The kind that thought the frontier's vastness would hide their sins. The hoofbeats grew closer. Mark could make out dark shapes moving between the trees now. The raiders were trying to circle the cabin, probably planning to attack from all sides at once. But the snow betrayed them, each step crunching no matter how careful they tried to be. Lonnie raised the Sharp's carbine, her breath fogging the glass. The other women tensed, stones and weapons ready. Mark felt the weight of their trust, there, lives in his hands. He had promised to protect them, not just from gossip or prejudice, but from this. From the men who had already taken so much from them, the raiders crept closer. Torches casting twisted shadows across the snow. Any moment now, they would rush the cabin. Mark's fingers settled on the trigger. Behind him, soft as a prayer, he heard Lonnie whisper, "The Lord is my shepherd." The raiders attacked without warning. Flaming arrows hissed through the night, striking the cabin's walls with dull thuds. Mark dropped low, steadying his Winchester against the window frame. Outside, dark shapes darted between trees, their torches casting wild shadows across the snow. "Get those fires lit," he shouted to the women stationed by the rear door. They had prepared signal fires on the ridge, 3 large pyres packed with green wood that would send thick smoke into the dawn sky. It was their best hope for drawing help from the settlement. An arrow punched through a window, showering glass across the floor. Mark answered with 2 quick shots, aiming high. "Warning shots first," he muttered. "Give them chance to run," but the raiders pressed closer. More arrows came, some wrapped with burning cloth. They struck the roof, the walls, the woodpile. Afraid. Women rushed to smother the flames with wet blankets while others hurled stones from their stockpile. Their aim was true. A pained cry rang out when one rock found its mark. Lonnie worked the Sharp's carbine with steady hands, firing whenever a raider exposed himself. Her shots were careful, disciplined. She wasn't trying to kill, just keep them back, make them think twice about rushing the cabin. "Riders coming!" One of the younger women called an Apache. She pointed east, where the signal fires now burned bright against the starless sky. Mark risked a glance. Torchlight bobbed in the distance. But were they friends or more raiders? War whoop split the night. The raiders charged, abandoning stealth for speed. They crashed through Mark's fence, trampling his garden. Some carried torches, others brandished clubs and rifles. Mark's Winchester spoke again and again. 2 raiders fell, clutching wounds to arm and leg. "Behind us," Lonnie shouted. Mark spun. Raiders had reached the back door, trying to break it down with an old log. The women met them with stones and farming tools. One swung a hoe with such force it cracked a raider's collarbone. Another threw boiling water through a gap in the boards. But they were outnumbered. A club smashed through a window, catching Mark in the shoulder. Pain exploded through his arm. The Winchester slipped from numbed fingers. He staggered, vision blurring. Strong hands grabbed him, Lonnie, dragging him behind an overturned table. "Stay down," she ordered, pressing a cloth to his bleeding head. But Mark pushed himself up. He couldn't let them fight alone. Hoofbeats thundered closer. Shouts rang out, Tinglish voices this time. "Over here, at Boone's place," the raiders faltered. More riders appeared, rifles gleaming. Mark recognized Sheriff Cawley's voice, then Cole's, then others from town. The settlers had come, drawn by the signal fires, just as they'd hoped. "Throw down your weapons," the sheriff bellowed. "You're surrounded." 2 raiders tried to run. Shots cracked out, not killing shots, but close enough to convince them to surrender. The others quickly followed. Within minutes, it was over. Dawn painted the sky pink as Sheriff Cawley and a dozen settlers secured the raiders. To lay wounded, the ones Mark had shot, while the rest knelt in the snow, hands bound. The women emerged from the cabin, heads high, still gripping their makeshift weapons. "My God, Boone," Cole breathed, staring at the scene. "These women fought like wildcats." "Saved your life, by my reckoning." "Saved all our lives," Mark corrected, wincing as Lonnie cleaned his head wound. "These are the same raiders who burned their village. Would have burned mine too, given chance." The sheriff studied the captives, recognized a few of these boys. Ben, causing trouble up and down the territory. Armies got warrants out for them. Mrs. Harper arrived with her wagon, bringing bandages and hot coffee. She moved among the women, checking for injuries, clucking at their bruises. The younger ones helped. Her tend the wounded raiders, even those who had tried to hurt them. "Ain't Christian to let them suffer," one woman explained in halting English when Cole questioned this mercy. Mark watched, pride swelling in his chest. The women had proved themselves not just brave, but honorable. They had defended his home as their own, fought alongside settlers who had once shunned them, and still showed compassion to their enemies. The sun rose fully, painting the snow gold. Settlers who had come ready for battle now stood sharing coffee with the Apache women, admiring their courage. Even Cole looked sheepish as he apologized to Lonnie for his past words. "Reckon we all misjudged you ladies," the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Anyone who fights to protect their neighbors like that, well, they're part of this community, far as I'm concerned." Lonnie finished binding Mark's wound, her touch gentle but sure. "We protect our own," she said simply. "Mark, give us home. We defend it." Mark caught her hand, squeezed it once in silent thanks. His shoulder ached fiercely, but his heart was light. The women had more than proved themselves. They had turned enemies into friends, fear into respect. As he watched them moving among the settlers, sharing food and bandages and quiet words of comfort, he knew something had changed. The morning light showed truth plain as day. These women belonged here. Part of his family, part of this land. Sheriff Callie organized a party to take the raiders to town. Others stayed to help repair the cabin's damaged walls and windows. The women worked alongside them, showing the same strength and skill that had defended the home through the night. Dawn's first light crept across the trampled snow, revealing the night's violence in stark detail. Sheriff Tom Callie walked the perimeter of Mark's cabin, boots crunching through broken glass and scattered arrows. His weathered face grew grim as he counted the bullet holes pocking the walls, the scorch marks from flaming arrows, and the splintered doorframe where raiders had tried to break through. "Could have been a massacre," he muttered, kneeling to examine a blood-stained patch of snow. If those signal fires hadn't brought us running, behind him, Cole Haskett sat on an overturned water barrel, grimacing as Mrs. Harper cleaned a gash on his arm. The rancher's usual bluster had faded, replaced by a thoughtful silence as he watched the Apache women helping tend to the wounded. "Never seen anything like it," Cole finally said, wincing as Mrs. Harper applied a poultice. "One of them raiders had me dead to rights. Would have split my skull if that tall one Lonnie hadn't knocked him flat with a fence post." He shook his head. "Saved my worthless hide. She did." "After all I said about them," the sheriff nodded slowly, "reckon we all got some crow to eat on that score." Inside the cabin, Mark sat at his scarred table while Lonnie checked his bandages. His shoulder throbbed where the club had struck, but the pain seemed distant compared to the warm pride filling his chest. Through the windows, he could see the other women working alongside settlers to clear debris and patch damaged walls. "Sheriff." A rider galloped up, reining his horse hard. "Army patrols coming. About an hour out." Tension rippled through the yard. The women stiffened, some reaching instinctively for weapons. But Sheriff Callie raised his hand for calm. "No need for alarm," he said, voice carrying clear in the morning air. "These women are under Mark Boone's protection and mine." He turned to face the gathered settlers. "They fought to defend one of our own last night, helped capture raiders that have been plaguing every ranch from here to the territory line. Far as I'm concerned, that makes them part of this community." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Even those who had been most suspicious nodded, impressed by the women's courage and skill. "They'll need supplies," Mrs. Harper spoke up, still tending Cole's wound. "Their gardens trampled, and winter's not done yet." "I can spare some flour," one settler offered. "Got extra blankets at my place," another added. "My boys can help rebuild that fence come morning." A third called out. The offers continued, each settler pledging what they could. Mark watched in amazement as the same people who had shunned his cabin now competed to show generosity. Mrs. Harper finished binding Cole's arm and walked over to where Lonnie stood. Without hesitation, she wrapped the Apache woman in a warm embrace. "Welcome home, dear," she said loudly enough for all to hear. The whispers that had haunted the women for weeks fell silent. Lonnie's eyes glistened as she returned the hug, "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing us as people." The morning wore on. The sheriff organized teams to repair the cabin while others rode to fetch promised supplies. The wounded raiders were loaded into wagons for the trip to town, where they would face justice for their crimes. Through it all, the women worked tirelessly, their quiet dignity winning more hearts with each passing hour. As evening approached, settlers began heading home, leaving Mark's cabin stronger than before. Fresh boards covered the broken windows, new hinges hung the battered door, and the woodpile had been rebuilt twice its original size through neighbors' contributions. Mark stood in his doorway, arm in a sling, watching the last wagon disappear down the snowy track. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and warmth. The women had prepared a simple feast from the day's gifts: fresh bread, dried meat, preserved fruits. More importantly, they had prepared their hearts for Thanksgiving. Lonnie lifted his worn Bible from its shelf, handling it with reverence. "We pray together," she asked. "Your words, our songs." Mark nodded, throat tight with emotion. They gathered around the table 12 Apache women who had become his family, who had fought beside him and saved not just his life, but his faith in human goodness. He opened the Bible with his good hand, finding comfort in the familiar pages. "The Lord is my shepherd," he began, voice growing stronger with each word. "I shall not want." The women listened intently, some following along in halting English. When he finished, they raised their voices in their own songs of gratitude. The melody, strange yet beautiful, filled every corner of the cabin. Mark closed his eyes, letting the harmonies wash over him. His stand had cost him pain and fear, but it had won something far more precious: respect between peoples, bridges across ancient divisions, and a family forged in courage and compassion. Outside, stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Inside, the cabin glowed with something brighter than firelight: the warm certainty of belonging, of hearts joined in thanksgiving for deliverance and new beginnings. The mountain snows retreated day by day, revealing muddy earth rich with promise. Mark watched from his porch as the Apache women worked their newly chosen plot of land, just visible through the stands of pine. With tools freely lent by transformed neighbors, they raised log walls and split rails for fencing, their hands strong and sure. Mark spent his mornings teaching them to gauge soil depth for plowing and string straight fence lines. In return, they showed him their ancient wisdom: how to dry seeds in clay pots when to plant by the moon's phases, which wild herbs would strengthen their crops. The townsfolk, who had once shunned them, now tipped their hats in passing, impressed by the women's determination. Even Cole Haskett stopped to admire their neat rows of early peas and onions. One evening, Mark and Lonnie walked the ridge trail as sunset painted the peaks crimson. She touched his arm gently. "You protected us like a father," she said softly. In her improving English, "We are grateful." Mark's eyes grew misty. "Truth is," he replied, "you all gave me reason to live again. Was just existing before. Now," he gestured to their flourishing homestead below. "Now, I got purpose." Spring blossomed fully across the highlands, painting the meadows in wildflower colors. The women's newly built cabins stood proudly against the mountainside, wisps of cooking smoke rising from their stone chimneys into the clear morning air. Wagons creaked up the path, loaded with gifts from townspeople who had once turned suspicious eyes their way. Sacks of seed corn, fresh-cut lumber, and garden tools rattled in the wagon beds. Mark watched as Mrs. Harper herself delivered a basket of apple seedlings. That evening, they gathered for a feast under the open sky. The aroma of roasted venison mingled with traditional Apache herbs. Songs rose into the twilight, ancient chants weaving together with familiar hymns Mark knew from church. The sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket. Later, alone on his porch, Mark gazed at the golden windows of their homesteads dotting the hillside. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "You took my solitude and gave me 12 daughters." The stars sparkled overhead as Mark smiled, knowing his heart would never know loneliness again. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.